scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the windows, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig was making breakfast downstairs, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper. But something was different about this day, something that none of them could have imagined. As Peppa brushed her teeth, she noticed her reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to move just a moment after she did. When she stopped brushing, her reflection continued for just a second longer. George noticed it too when he came to wash his face. Their reflections had dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare back at them with an unsettling intensity. During breakfast, the family sat around their usual table, but the food tasted strange. The cereal seemed to whisper when they poured the milk, and the toast made soft crying sounds when they bit into it. Mummy Pig's smile never left her face, even when she wasn't looking at anyone. Daddy Pig's newspaper had no words, just pictures of empty rooms and shadows. When they went outside to play, the playground was completely silent. No other children were there, no birds were singing, and even the wind had stopped. The swings moved by themselves, creaking back and forth with no one on them. The slide seemed longer than usual, disappearing into darkness at the bottom. Peppa and George decided to visit their friends, but when they knocked on Susie Sheep's door, no one answered. Through the window, they could see Susie sitting at her table, but she wasn't moving at all. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, and her mouth was frozen in a smile that was too wide. As they walked through the town, they realized that everyone was like this. Pedro Pony stood motionless in his garden. Rebecca Rabbit sat perfectly still on her porch, and all their friends had the same empty stare and unnatural smile. The whole town had become a collection of living dolls. When they returned home, Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in the living room, but they too had changed. Their eyes had become completely black, and their smiles stretched impossibly wide across their faces. They spoke in perfect unison, their voices echoing strangely in the room. The house itself began to change around them. The walls started to breathe slowly, expanding and contracting like lungs. The pictures on the walls showed scenes that moved and shifted, displaying moments that had never happened. The stairs seemed to multiply, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Peppa and George ran to their bedroom, but it was no longer the same room they had woken up in. The toys had arranged themselves in perfect circles, all facing the center of the room. Their teddy bears had button eyes that followed their every movement, and the dollhouse contained tiny figures that looked exactly like their family. As night fell, the darkness outside was absolute. No stars, no moon, just an endless black void pressing against the windows. The house creaked and groaned, and strange shadows moved across the walls without anything to cast them. Peppa and George hugged each other tightly, wondering if they would ever see the real world again. The last thing they heard before everything went silent was the sound of their own voices, coming from somewhere else in the house, laughing and playing as if nothing had ever been wrong. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her toys. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed that her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she realized that Mummy Pig's eyes weren't blinking at all. They just stared straight ahead, unmoving, while her hands mechanically stirred the porridge in perfect, rhythmic circles. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching Peppa with eyes that seemed too wide and too dark. When Peppa tried to speak to him, George's mouth opened, but instead of his usual babbling, only a low, continuous whisper emerged. The house itself began to feel wrong. The familiar yellow walls of the kitchen seemed to pulse gently, as if they were breathing. The cheerful family photos on the walls showed the same smiling faces, but now their eyes followed Peppa wherever she moved. The clock on the wall had stopped at exactly midnight, even though bright daylight filled the room. When Daddy Pig came down for breakfast, he moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, his glasses reflecting nothing but darkness. As the family sat around the breakfast table, they all turned to look at Peppa simultaneously, their heads moving in perfect unison like synchronized dolls. The porridge in Peppa's bowl began to move on its own, swirling in patterns that formed shapes she didn't want to recognize. The spoon in her hand felt ice cold, and when she looked down, she saw that her own reflection in the metal surface was smiling a smile she wasn't making. Outside, the world had become equally strange. The trees in the garden stood motionless despite a wind that Peppa could hear but not feel. The birds in the sky hung suspended like they were painted on glass. Even the muddy puddles that Peppa loved so much had turned into perfect black mirrors. As the day progressed, more family members arrived for what seemed like a normal visit, but each one moved with the same unnatural stillness. The toys in Peppa's room had rearranged themselves into perfect circles, and her beloved teddy bear now had button eyes that seemed to follow her movements. When bedtime finally came, Peppa climbed the stairs that seemed to stretch longer with each step. Her bedroom door was exactly where it should be, but when she opened it, the room beyond was not quite the same room she had woken up in that morning. As Peppa lay in her bed, she could hear the house settling around her, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. The last thing Peppa remembered before sleep, scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Peppa's birthday, and the whole family was excited about the party. Grandpa Pig had promised to bring something very special from his attic. When he arrived, he carried an old wooden box covered in dust and strange symbols that seemed to move when nobody was looking directly at them. Inside the box was an antique music box with a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa, but its smile was painted too wide and its eyes were just black dots. When Grandpa Pig wound it up, the melody that played was the Peppa Pig theme song, but it sounded wrong, like it was being played backwards and underwater. The little figure began to dance, spinning faster and faster. As the music played, strange things began happening around the house. The birthday balloons started deflating one by one, but instead of falling to the ground, they floated upward and disappeared through the ceiling. The birthday cake began to change colors, shifting from pink to green to black, and the candles lit themselves. Peppa noticed that her reflection in the windows was moving differently than she was. When she waved her right hand, her reflection waved its left. When she smiled, her reflection frowned. Slowly, all the reflections in the house began acting independently, as if they were trying to escape from the mirrors. The music box wouldn't stop playing, even when Grandpa Pig tried to close it. The melody grew louder and more distorted, and other sounds began mixing with it. There were whispers in a language nobody recognized, and the sound of footsteps coming from empty rooms upstairs. The little dancing figure had stopped looking like Peppa. George's toys began moving on their own, but not in a playful way. His dinosaur walked in perfect circles, making the same mechanical roar over and over. His teddy bear sat up and stared at the family with button eyes that seemed to follow their movements. All the toys moved in rhythm with the cursed music box. The house itself started to change. Doors that had always been there suddenly weren't, and new doors appeared in walls where there had never been openings before. Some doors led to rooms that were impossibly large, while others opened onto complete darkness. The stairs began leading to different floors. Mummy Pig tried to call for help, but the telephone made no sound when she picked it up. Instead, she could hear the music box melody playing through the receiver, along with voices that sounded like her family, but were saying things they had never said. The birthday guests who were supposed to arrive never came. When the family looked outside, they saw their friends standing at the garden gate, but they weren't moving. They stood perfectly still like statues, all facing the house with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. As evening approached, the family realized they couldn't leave the house. Every exit led back to the same room where the music box continued its endless, haunting melody. The windows showed different views each time they looked through them. Finally, as the clock struck midnight on what should have been Peppa's birthday, the music box snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones. The house fell completely silent, but the silence was worse than the music had been. In that silence, the family understood that the birthday party would never end, and that they had become part of the music box themselves.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting shadows that moved independently. Her toys appeared to be watching her with tiny, unblinking eyes. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast in silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned with her characteristic smile, but it seemed too wide, stretching impossibly. Her eyes reflected nothing at all. George was playing with his dinosaur toy, but its roar sounded deeper, more menacing. George giggled, but his laughter echoed strangely, bouncing off the walls like whispers. After breakfast, Peppa visited Susie's sheep. The walk felt endless, and trees swayed without wind, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers trying to grab her red dress. At Susie's house, Peppa found her friends staring at flowers that had turned completely black overnight. Susie's wool seemed darker, and her voice sounded distant. They decided to play in muddy puddles, but all the puddles had turned into perfect mirrors. Their reflections stared back with wrong expressions, smiling when they weren't, frowning when they were happy. Suddenly, Peppa's reflection began moving independently, waving from inside the puddle. Soon all reflections were moving on their own, creating a silent dance. The playground equipment moved without children. Swings swayed in rhythm, the slide grew taller, and the roundabout spun slowly, playing a melody like a dying music box. More friends arrived, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, Candy Cat, but each seemed off. Their colors were wrong shades, voices carried echoes, and shadows fell in impossible directions. When going home, the path looked different. Houses leaned inward, creating a tunnel effect. Windows reflected not sky, but endless dark spaces. At home, Daddy Pig read a blank newspaper, nodding at invisible words. He said it was about a little pig who discovered her world wasn't what it seemed. During dinner, everyone ate, but plates remained full. Food replenished itself, and conversation felt hollow, like echoes from long ago. At bedtime, each stair-step took Peppa higher than it should. From her window, she saw impossible places, distant mountains, vast oceans, cities with wrong-colored lights. In bed, the house settled with rhythmic sounds, as if breathing like a sleeping giant. Before sleep, Peppa saw another version of herself in the house across the street. The other Peppa waved, and when she waved back, she realized tomorrow would be another perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, and everything would begin again exactly as today. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. All their toys were exactly where they had left them the night before, yet somehow they appeared to be watching her with tiny, unblinking eyes. George was still sleeping peacefully, clutching his beloved dinosaur toy. Peppa climbed down the ladder quietly, but as her feet touched the floor, she heard a soft whisper coming from somewhere in the room. She turned around slowly, but saw nothing unusual. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, humming her favorite tune. But when Peppa entered the room, she noticed that Mummy Pig's reflection in the window was humming a completely different melody. The reflection seemed to move independently, turning its head to look directly at Peppa. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, but the words on the pages kept changing every time Peppa looked away. First it was the weather forecast, then suddenly it became a story about missing children, and then it transformed into something written in a strange language. George finally came downstairs, dragging his dinosaur behind him, but the toy left a trail of what looked like tiny footprints on the floor. When Peppa pointed this out to her family, they all looked at her with the same confused expression. Their smiles seemed wider than usual. After breakfast, the family decided to visit Grandpa and Grandma Pig's house. The car ride felt longer than normal, and Peppa noticed that they kept passing the same tree over and over again. The radio played cheerful music, but occasionally the melody would distort. When they arrived at Grandpa Pig's house, Everything appeared normal from the outside, but as soon as they stepped through the front door, Peppa realized that the house was much larger inside than it should have been. Grandma Pig greeted them with her usual warm smile, but her eyes remained completely still while the rest of her face moved. She offered them tea and biscuits, but when Peppa looked down at her cup, she saw her own reflection staring back at her, except the reflection was frowning. As the day progressed, Peppa began to notice that time was moving strangely. The clock on the wall would jump forward several hours, then suddenly move backward. When it was time to go home, the family said their goodbyes, but as they walked toward the car, Peppa looked back and saw that Grandpa and Grandma Pig were still waving from the window. Back in their own house, everything returned to normal. But that night, as Peppa lay in her bed, she could hear soft footsteps walking around downstairs. The footsteps moved in a perfect circle, never stopping. When morning came, Peppa woke up to find that it was Tuesday again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV because it was too disturbing for children. The episode begins on a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning when Peppa and George wake up to find that all the clocks in their house have stopped at exactly 3:33. When they ask Mummy Pig about it, she just smiles and says that time doesn't matter anymore, her voice echoing strangely as if coming from far away. At breakfast, the food on their plates keeps changing every time they look away. Peppa's cereal becomes tiny plastic eyes that blink at her, while George's toast grows small fingers that wave goodbye before disappearing. Daddy Pig reads a newspaper where all the words rearrange themselves into the same sentence over and over. They are watching you from the mirrors. When they go outside to play, the playground equipment has multiplied overnight. There are now dozens of swings, all moving in perfect synchronization without any wind. The slide has become impossibly long, stretching up into the clouds where children's laughter echoes down but no children can be seen. Other families are there too, but they all move like marionettes, their strings visible against the sky. Susie Sheep approaches Peppa, but when she speaks, her voice comes out backwards, and her reflection in the puddles shows a completely different animal altogether. Pedro Pony gallops in circles so fast that he becomes a blur, leaving trails of color that spell out warnings in languages that don't exist. The most unsettling part comes when they return home for lunch. The house looks exactly the same from the outside, but inside, every room leads to the same hallway, and that hallway leads to more rooms that are identical to the ones they just left. Family photos on the walls show them in places they've never been, doing things they don't remember doing. As the day progresses, Peppa begins to notice that everyone's shadows are moving independently, sometimes several seconds before the person casting them moves. George's favorite dinosaur toy starts following him around the house, its plastic eyes tracking his movements, even when he's not looking at it. The episode ends with the family sitting down for dinner, but the table is set for 8 people instead of 4. When Peppa asks who the extra places are for, Mummy Pig points to the empty chairs and says, "For the other versions of us, dear. The ones who live in the mirrors." As the camera pulls back, viewers can see that indeed, there are other families sitting at identical tables in the reflections of every shiny surface in the room, all eating the same meal, all moving in perfect unison, all staring directly at the camera with knowing smiles.